If you want proof that oil still runs the modern world, do not start with a history book. Start with an American gas station. The moment supply risk rises in the Middle East, prices jump, politicians start performing emotional damage control, and people who have not said the words Strait of Hormuz since high school suddenly become part-time energy analysts.
It's more complicated than that. It's global demand.
That is the thing about oil. It disappears from the public imagination right up until it absolutely does not. And when it comes back fast. At the pump, in airline tickets, in shipping costs, in grocery bills, and in the price of everything that depends on trucks, plastics, fertilizer, chemicals, packaging, or industrial heat, which is to say, almost everything. That is the first mistake people make. They think oil is mainly about gasoline. It is not. Oil is not just something you burn, it is something you build with. It sits inside plastics, synthetic fabrics, fertilizers, lubricants, solvents, packaging, asphalt, medical materials, industrial chemicals, and the giant logistical machine quietly holding up modern life. Your world may look sleek, digital, and post-industrial, but under the hood, it is still very physical, and a shocking amount of that physical system still leans on oil. Which is awkward, because modern society loves telling itself a cleaner story, a shinier story, a story where we have heroically moved beyond dirty hydrocarbons and are now floating into the future on software, batteries, and self-congratulation. And yet the minute oil supply gets nervous, the whole system acts like it just heard a fire alarm. That should tell you something, because the real question is not whether oil is old. Obviously it is old. The real question is this: if oil belongs to the past, why does the present still panic every time supply looks shaky? To answer that, you have to go back to the beginning. Not for long. Nobody needs a full semester right now. Before petroleum became king, lighting was expensive and messy. Whale oil was widely used in lamps, which means human civilization once looked at giant ocean mammals and thought, yes, this seems like a sustainable lighting strategy. Then, in 1859, Edwin Drake drilled a successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, helping launch the modern petroleum industry. But the real breakthrough was not just finding oil, it was learning how to control everything around it. That is where John D. Rockefeller changed the
I represent
game.
the interests of the refinery.
Rockefeller understood a
Efficiency
rule
and
that
stability
still
are our
governs
top
power
priorities.
today. Finding the resource matters, but controlling the bottlenecks matters more. So Standard Oil did not just drill, it built leverage around refining, transport, storage, pricing, and distribution. And by the late 19th century, Standard Oil dominated American refining. That was bigger than a successful company. That was industrial gravity. And the logic never really changed. If you control the choke points, you do not just participate in the market, you shape the market. Sometimes you practically become the market. Then oil stopped being only business, it became strategy. In the early 20th century, Winston Churchill pushed Britain's navy away from coal and toward oil, because oil meant speed, range, and military advantage. The problem was that Britain did not have enough domestic oil, so the British government took a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1914.
The overseas supply is critical.
That
We must
move
secure it immediately,
was a
at any
warning
cost.
shot for the century ahead.
Represents a mutual commitment to the
Energy
project.
was no
very
longer
optimistic
just an
about the future
input
cooperation.
for industry. It was state power. And once oil became state power, it stopped being a normal commodity. It became a geopolitical lever. That is the part people often miss. Oil mattered because it powered ships, aircraft, armies, factories, freight, fertilizers, and mass industrial life. It sat at the intersection of war, commerce, and national survival, which is a dangerous place for any resource to live. By the middle of the 20th century, giant Western oil firms held enormous influence over production and pricing, especially in the Middle East. But the oil came from one set of countries, while much of the leverage sat somewhere else. And that imbalance was not built to last. In 1960, OPEC was founded in Baghdad by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. This was not just an organization. It was producers trying to seize more control over the thing the world could not stop needing. Then came the shock that made everyone pay attention. In 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil producers imposed an embargo on the United States and several other countries. Prices surged, gas lines formed, inflation worsened, and the industrialized world got a brutal reminder that modern economies were far less stable than they liked to imagine. That crisis changed the psychology of power. Once oil can shake Washington, Tokyo, and Western Europe at the same time, governments stop treating energy as something they merely buy. They start treating it as something they fear losing. And fear changes behavior. It shapes alliances, military planning, strategic reserves, diplomacy, and the kind of late-night phone calls that make finance ministers age like avocados. Now, around here, people usually leap into the petrodollar story and start acting like one diagram can explain half a century of history. It cannot. History is ruder than that. But the broad point is real. After Bretton Woods fell apart, the United States deepened security and financial ties with major oil producers, especially Saudi Arabia. Oil revenues flowed through dollar-based systems, and global demand for oil helped reinforce global demand for dollars. So yes, energy and finance became tightly intertwined. Just not in the cartoon version some people post online with too much confidence and too little sleep. Now, pause the history for a second and ask the obvious question. What if oil vanished tomorrow? Not in 30 years, not after 7 climate summits, 3 elections, and a heroic LinkedIn post. Tomorrow. The answer is ugly. Cars and trucks would get hit first. That part is obvious. But commercial aviation would take a major blow. Shipping would seize up. Fertilizer production would suffer. Food costs would rise. Medical supply chains would strain. Construction materials would get more expensive. And plastics, industrial chemicals, lubricants, solvents, synthetic fabrics, and packaging would all get squeezed. Because when people say oil, they usually imagine gas stations. What they should imagine is the physical backbone of a high-consumption civilization. Take oil away suddenly, and the modern economy stops looking futuristic very quickly.
Future remains unfulfilled.
It starts looking fragile. And here is the really awkward part. Even the future that is supposed to replace oil still depends heavily on oil. Electric vehicles do not burn gasoline while driving. That part is true. But EVs are still built inside a world of mining, refining, petrochemicals, industrial heat, heavy transport, plastics, coatings, synthetic materials, and global shipping. The tires still rely heavily on petrochemical inputs. The factories still sit inside a fossil-fueled industrial system. And the logistics behind the clean transition are not powered by good vibes. The same is true for solar panels, wind turbines, semiconductors, batteries, and data centers. A cleaner future may absolutely be possible, but it is not arriving in a beam of moral purity. It is being assembled by a giant material system that still uses a lot of oil and gas. And that is exactly why this story feels so current in America right now. Look at what is happening in 2026. When conflict in the Middle East tightens supply expectations, U.S. drivers feel it almost immediately. Gas prices climb toward $4 a gallon. Headlines get louder, and suddenly, oil is not some abstract geopolitical topic. It is a domestic mood. It is dinner table economics. At the exact same time, the AI boom is colliding with a very old reality. Digital empires still need physical energy. Data centers need land, steel, concrete, cooling, backup systems, transmission lines, and enormous amounts of electricity. That is why some of the most futuristic conversations in America right now keep circling back to extremely old-school words like gas plants, grid bottlenecks, fuel security, and industrial load growth. That is not a contradiction. That is the point. The future may be digital on the screen, but underneath the screen, it is still built out of molecules, wires, metals, heat, concrete, and logistics. And once you understand that, oil stops looking like a relic. It starts looking like hidden infrastructure. Now, here is where a lot of people get confused. The energy transition is real. Electric vehicles are real. Renewables are real. Battery investment is real. And America's grid and industrial base are changing. All of that is true. But transition does not mean detachment. It means overlap. For a long time, the world is going to live in both systems at once. The old hydrocarbon system and the newer electrified system. That makes everything messier. Oil shocks can make EVs look more attractive, but building more EVs still depends heavily on hydrocarbons, mining, shipping, industrial heat, and petrochemical materials. So the transition is happening. It is just not clean, simple, or fast enough to erase oil from the structure of modern life. It is more like replacing the engine while the vehicle is still moving, and everyone inside is arguing about the map. Then there is the American shale boom. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling unlocked massive reserves once considered uneconomic. The United States became the world's largest crude oil producer. And that changed the strategic picture in a major way. It gave America more flexibility, more supply, and more room to absorb shocks than it had during the 1970s. But shale did not abolish geopolitics, it just changed America's position inside it. The US still lives inside a global oil market. Prices still react to wars, shipping disruptions, refinery constraints, and maritime choke points, which is why a narrow stretch of water, half a world away, can still reach directly into an American commute, an airline ticket, or a weekly grocery run. That narrow stretch of water is the Strait of Hormuz, and the fact that so much oil still moves through it should tell you everything you need to know about how post-oil the world really is. So no, oil is not as politically untouchable as it looked in the 20th century. Its dominance is softer, its monopoly is weaker, and its public image is worse. But its ability to move markets, shape strategy, pressure governments, and expose the physical limits of modern life is still very real. What is changing is the form of the competition. The world is not moving from oil to no oil. It is moving into a more crowded contest involving oil, gas, electricity, batteries, semiconductors, grid infrastructure, shipping lanes, AI infrastructure, and critical minerals. The system is diversifying. It is not becoming simple. And that means the core rule never changed. The winners are not just the people who own a resource. The winners are the people who control the bottlenecks around the resource: processing, transport, finance, infrastructure, security, and technology. That was true for Rockefeller. It was true for empires. It was true during the oil shocks. And it is still true now, even if the language got updated and the PowerPoint got more expensive. So is the age of oil ending? Eventually, oil may lose the overwhelming dominance it had in the 20th century. That is possible, maybe likely over the long run. But the deeper struggle is not ending at all. It is just changing costume. Tomorrow's power may depend more on batteries, grids, advanced manufacturing, chip supply chains, AI infrastructure, and the minerals behind electrification. But the governing logic remains brutally familiar. Whoever controls energy, or the systems built around energy, gets a major say in how the world works. So the next time someone tells you oil is yesterday's story, remember this: yesterday's story is still paying a very large part of today's bills. And every time the system gets nervous, oil still has the power to remind everyone that modern civilization is not floating above the material world. It is standing on it. And that material world is still far more oily than the branding would like you to believe.